Hi, I'm Dan from Foundations Zambia, and today we're going to talk about management principles. We talk a lot about farming here. Of course, we talk about what's best for the soil, what's best for the plant. But there's something else that we believe is crucial to be a successful farmer, and that is to do everything on time, at high standard, without wastage, and with joy. In fact, we're so passionate about those four things, we walk around with them on our backs all the time. So what does that mean? Well, let's start with on time. You know, the Bible says that there's a time for everything and a season for everything under heaven. And when we think about farming, we know that farming is so dependent on the sun and the rain. And these are things that God has created, and it's wonderful. But we want to get into that flow. We want to align ourselves with creation. And so when we think about crops, for example, in the field, we know that there's a certain time that we should plant those crops. One of the things that makes this really interesting is actually the sun itself. I think we all know that in June the days are short, and it gets light later and it gets dark earlier, and in December the days are long. It gets light earlier and gets dark later. This is actually really important to a farmer because it's that light, it's that heat that makes our crops grow. And so, for example, maize is traditionally planted sometime in December, sometimes at Christmas, sometimes even later than Christmas. But did you know that the longest day of the year is the 22nd of December, plus or minus one or 2 days. And if we plant maize at or after the shortest day of the year, we are effectively sabotaging our maize crop because we're asking it to grow when it needs light and heat into shorter days. What we've done here at Foundations Zambia is we've actually tried to demonstrate that by planting maize at the best possible time, and then 10 days later, 10 days later, 10 days later, until it's planted at really the worst possible time. And we have demonstrated through this research that the maize yield can actually be tripled if only we plant at the right time. This row of maize is where we've researched the effect of planting on different dates and the benefit that can come to us from planting on time. The maize I'm standing in front of here was planted on 15 November, which is the earliest date we recommend planting depending on your rainfall in your particular area and depending on the variety of maize that you plant. After that, we waited 10 days to plant the next maize, and 10 days, and then until we planted on Christmas our last set of maize. The research that we've done here has yielded some really interesting results. The maize behind me, which we planted on 15 November, has yielded in the past the equivalent of 9 tons per hectare, which is fantastic. We're really excited about that. And the maize which is planted later than that, the yield goes down. The yield steadily decreases until we get to the maize planted on Christmas, which has yielded about 3 tons per hectare. So you can see there's a threefold difference in the yield of maize from just changing the planting date, wherein everything else has been exactly the same: the seed, the fertilizer, the lime, and the compost. Here I am standing by the maize which we planted on Christmas. And as you can see, it hasn't caught up to the maize which was planted on time. And quite honestly, it will never catch up. You may also be wondering, how can we start preparing our soil in June or October when the soil just seems to be too hard? But remember that we're not digging up the whole field, we're just digging planting basins in the case of maize and pigeon pea, or small furrows in the case of soya or groundnuts. And if we start with enough time, we can find that with a few hours a day, respectable fields can be prepared on time. But that's not the end of the story. I said it was a journey. And the truth is that if we continue on not plowing and we continue on protecting our fields with mulch and with rotating our fields and with using compost, we have seen here And I can tell you that the soil does get softer. The second principle that we are passionate about, that we wear on our backs, is high standard, doing things at a high standard. You know, God is not a haphazard God, He's a God of order. When we look in the Bible at the way God gave instructions to Noah to build the ark, and Ezekiel, the measurements of the temple, we can see that God is glorified when things are in order and done at a high standard. And I think we all know that too. When we've built something to a high standard, it just shines and it brings that joy. And that's what we want to have in our farming as well, whether in our fields or in our gardens. One aspect of high standards is measuring. So whenever we prepare our fields or prepare our gardens, we always want to ask, what is the right spacing for this crop? Or when we come to put lime or fertilizer in our fields, we want to ask ourselves, what's the right measurement? And then we take a cup that's the right size and we measure it the right way. Another aspect is weeding. You know, when we keep our fields weed free, it does shine with the glory of God, because we have we've maintained our fields at a high standard. But you know, when we do that, we also reap another benefit, which is that our plants grow better. And here we have an example behind us of a little field of soya that for the whole season was never touched. It was planted well, it was planted with fertilizer and compost, but it was never weeded. And so many times we think that weeds are, you know, they're bad, but they're not that bad. Let's just put a little extra fertilizer or something like that and let everything grow up. But you know, these weeds are clever. Oh, they're clever. They know exactly where to go to get the nutrients that our crops need. They know exactly where to go to get the water that our crops need. And so when we have a field that's overtaken by weeds, it will never produce even close to what it would if we had been keeping that field weed-free at a high standard. Sometimes we even say, well, the weeds are growing, I'll get to it eventually. So that's what we've done here. Next to this field that has never been weeded is a little field of soya where, yeah, we've weeded, but we were late. We said to ourselves, the weeds are coming, okay, we'll get to it. And we got to it. But if you look at this soya and compare it to the soya that has been weeded on time and kept at a high standard, my friends, it has not caught up, because those weeds have stolen exactly what our soya needed at the time that it needed it. So we encourage you, how can you in your gardening or in your farming start doing things at a high standard? The third of what we call our management principles is without wastage. You know, have you ever noticed that in the Bible, when Jesus fed the 5,000, after everyone was full, He actually had His disciples go and pick up the leftover pieces of food so that nothing would be wasted. And this really demonstrates, I think, the heart of God, that wastage is an affront to God's generous heart. And you know, think about yourself. When you give a gift to someone, you would love for them to use it and to cherish it, and for it to have an effect in their life, not for them to drop it on the way home. And so as farmers, we should be thinking about the ways in which we aren't using well the resources which God has entrusted to us. So when we look at this field here, these weeds mean that there's tremendous wastage in this field. The seeds, the fertilizer, the compost, even the rain that fell from the sky has been wasted. But that's not the only thing that we can say about these weeds. Although these weeds have brought wastage into our farming, we can redeem it. In fact, there's many things that we look at around and we say, this is of no value. Whether it be grass clippings, whether it be vegetable scraps, old thatching grass, maize stalks, weeds. We can take them, and instead of wasting them, we can use them. Those weeds which we which unfortunately has brought wastage into our fields, can be redeemed. Along with other things, we can make this compost out of those things. We're going to cover compost in another lesson. But in short, this kind of compost takes all of those things that may be seen as as rubbish and puts them together at a high temperature, killing all the weed seeds and all the diseases that may be in there, and produces something that feeds our soil. Wastage is all around us if we look. If we don't have mulch on our fields and in our garden, essentially we're wasting water. Or in the rainy season, we're wasting rain. Or with measurements. If we just sort of grab a handful of seed or a handful of fertilizer and scatter it in our fields, we may find that we're actually putting too much or too little, causing the weeds to flourish or causing our plants to be sick. Rather, we teach using measurements. There's simple ways that we can reduce the wastage in our farming without putting an undue burden on us, because none of this is about beating yourself up or feeling bad about yourself, but it's actually all about joyfully receiving the gifts that God has given us, using them well, and producing in abundance. That's the heart behind without wastage. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and learned one way that you can bring life back to your soils. Feel free to leave a comment below or visit us at our website, foundationszambia.org.